This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Let me read a passage from the New York Post that caught my attention. Talking about Tiger Woods. And sports psychologist Dr. Michael Lardon, a Long Island native now living in San Diego, who has worked with PGA Tour pros for years, told the Post that Woods' struggle is, quote, one of the most bizarre, unusual things that I've seen in professional sports. To me, it's like Roger Federer not being able to make a second serve. You're looking at a guy with the most sublime short game, one of the top few in history. Can you imagine Phil Mickelson blading 9 shots in one round? It wouldn't even be fathomable conceptually. Lardon said he finds it hard to believe Woods' theory that his problems are all technical, adding he thinks Woods has become too technical. Quote, they don't give you the trophy for the best biomechanically perfect golf swing. I think he got off track with this where it became more of an academic exercise for him, and he moved from being an artist, this amazing artist, to someone who's more of a biomechanic, end quote. I just randomly see this passage in the New York Post, and I say to myself, I got to get this guy Michael on my podcast. So today I have Michael Lardon on my podcast. Dr. Michael Lardon is one of the premier mental performance coaches in the world, with clients in more than a dozen professional and Olympic sports. His athletes have won major golf championships, Olympic gold medals, Super Bowls, and World Series titles, among other achievements. His book, or at least one of his books, is called Mastering Golf's Mental Game. What a fascinating conversation. How lucky am I that I can reach out to Michael, a stranger? And I'm sure, he checked me out to make sure it's okay, of course. But I think what follows is a great conversation. And this conversation is applicable to all walks of life, not just golf. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Michael Lardon. Your field, where you're at, wow, just fascinating stuff. I mean, I think back to being a young guy playing baseball, and I played into my first year in college. And I look back and I realize how much the mental was that was the element. That was the issue. And those few moments that I can remember where everything was slowed down. And you just recall those few moments. And I think what you map out in your career is it's for the great ones, it's not the few moments. They've figured out how to do it quite a bit, haven't they?
When I was 16 years old, I was playing in the finals of the United States Junior Table Tennis Championships in Caesar's Palace. And long story short, in table tennis and world-class table tennis, the ball moves close to 100 miles an hour on a 9-foot table. The ball started to come in slow motion. And I had just gotten back. I was training in Japan with a world champion. I was, on the national junior team. And it was such a profound experience to see the ball slow down that it had this riveting effect on me. Now, the interesting part of the story is that I won the first 2 games. My coach said something, like this is going to be a very unusual, win, a big upset. And then I sort of snapped out of it. But that event told me that, clearly there was something, between the ears at the higher level. I had just been in Japan at a place called Senshu University, which is really a sports university outside of Tokyo. And I was taken there by a large table tennis manufacturer called Butterfly to train for the summer. They also had martial artists there. It was very clear that the mental energy was changed into some kind of kinetic energy. I played professionally in Germany and in Europe and Asia till I was about 20. And then when I went to school, my lab partner at Stanford University was Eric Heiden, and he had just won 5 gold medals in the Olympics the year before.
Good guy to have for a lab partner, right?
Yeah. He's a little like me in that we sat in the back. He's a physician now. He's team surgeon for U.S. Ski, and cycling and some other stuff. But, it almost said, it was like God put this guy in my lap, so to speak, and he was my case study. And then during our schooling together, he concomitantly, he had left speed skating, and unbeknownst to me, I remember he raised his hand in Dr. Coleman's chemistry class and said, "Hey, Dr. Coleman, I'd like to take a couple weeks off because I have a bike race." And everybody laughed because, we knew who he was. And Dr. Coleman said, "It wouldn't be a bike race in France now, would it, Eric?" And then, of course, it was the Tour de France. So I think that reinforced it. And then in my undergraduate studies, I was very fortunate to have some intellectual heavyweights teach me, and one of the professors was Robert Ornstein, who wrote a famous book, Psychology of Consciousness. I started to think about, how, these states of consciousness, how they affect performance, whether it's in sports, art, what have you. It became clear to me that the more training I had, the better. So I kind of took a hiatus to go to medical school, knowing that it would be, a lot of memory. I wouldn't really have the chance to do that stuff at that time. But after I finished medical school, I did my residency, and then I wrote a grant to the United States Tennis Association, and it was accepted, to study electrophysiologic parameters of performance, so brain waves. At the same time, next thing you know, my little brother got a PGA Tour card, and people say, how do you become the shrink for the players on the PGA Tour? And I always say, well, one, you need a brother on tour, and you need to caddy for him. And I started caddying for him, and then, that's 20 some odd years ago. And so that's how that clientele built. And then concomitantly, through my contacts, through Eric, who's been a close friend through the years, I started to get a number of Olympic athletes referred to me. So we did a bunch of hard science work in the early 90s through the last 15 to 20-ish years, really more clinical operative
Let
stuff.
me jump at some questions with you. And one thing I'll make a comment about Eric Heiden. I'm old enough in my mid-40s to remember him and remember the size of his thighs as a speed skater. So the physicality,
32 inches.
Right. The physicality of that man, everyone remembers, but the big deal was he won everything. And to win everything, it didn't make a difference if you were the best physically. He clearly had to have had a mental focus that was extraordinary.
There was a course at Stanford that we were invited into, and it was something along the lines of, 12 athletes. I was fortunate enough to be there. Eric Heiden was, and then Stanford had these amazing, I forget who the swimmer was, but, people that were all at the very highest level. And then they would bring in 1 week like Ernest Hilgard, who was one of the fathers of hypnosis, then Michael Murphy, who was one of the original founders of Esalen Institute, who wrote a number of famous books on consciousness. And then we had to present stuff from our own life material. And Eric actually talked about in the 5,000 meter race that he could visualize, and he's a very understated, humble guy. I mean, there's no hyperbole with him, that he could visualize to the stride of 5,000 meters. Now, you and I probably can't tell you, how many steps it is to get out the door. So, his prowess in terms of mental clarity, and what was also amazing was, I asked him, I said, so why do you even think you can cycle, let alone be on the national team and compete in the Tour de France? And he had an ability to kind of look at it in a kind of a mathematical way, a scientific way. He knew his power output. He knew all these kinds of parameters, and nothing was colored with what we call neuroticism, where, people, they doubt themselves and all this kind of thing. He innately didn't have that. And sure enough, he was a great test taker. I mean, we studied together. I'd know more and he could get a better grade, which of course was, frustrating for me, but in a good way though. So you're right. I mean, there was something between his ears, whether he was a champion academically, which he was, went to Stanford Medical School after, and trained with James Andrews, who's really is the premier orthopedic surgeon in the world of sports, or whether he was competing in sports himself. So there was something very unique about him, as there are about very similar to many of the great athletes in today's world.
So I want to go into some of where you go in your new book, which I have had a chance to go through, which is Mastering Golf's Mental Game. And I think one of the great examples in there, and I know what's happened right now, because you had some interesting comments in the press about Tiger Woods recently. And I want to go into those, but I first want to let you establish your chops a little bit more in golf, because there's a great example, and you've worked closely with Phil Mickelson. And I mean, he wrote the foreword to your book. That's a great idea of how closely you work with him. But I think it'd be interesting if you talked about his loss at the 2013 Open and then his win at the British Open a month later. Why don't you talk about the process of that big loss, the big win, and how you were assisting him during this period? What were you doing? How were you helping him? I mean, this guy's one of the best golfers of all time, Hall of Famer. Why does he need help?
I mean, if I think back how it started, I had known Phil a little bit through the years, and I helped his younger brother coach the local golf team, the USD golf team, University of San Diego. So what happened somewhere along the line is Phil got a hold of me at Riviera one year, some years ago, and asked to meet with me. Basically he said, my game right now is really good. My short game's good. My ball striking's good. All the different components, but, I'm not winning. Because of that, I want to seek somebody with your expertise. Phil, prior to that, he had been a psychology major at Arizona. He had studied a little bit on sports psychology, but he had never really worked with anybody. So that's how it started. And he was it's been very fun to work with because, one, he's very bright. He has very little in the way of arrogance in terms of opening up to new ideas. He's willing to try, almost anything. And then he has this, fervent energy and the ability to apply himself, in a very full way. To answer your question, before the U.S. Open, we worked in different parts of his game, and these guys, it's a little like a Ferrari. There's always some tinkering. One piece is a little out of sync, and then you got to get that back in, and then kind of something else gets out of sync. Players like Phil, they can go fix things in a day where other players might take, a long time. Phil gets on the phone to Butch Harmon, who's his swing coach these days, and they can figure that piece out. I sort of work with him on that and some putting stuff. One, I think, a sentinel event for me was he was struggling with putting, different grips. I think it was for the Masters of that year. And I just asked him really simply, when did you putt best? He said, when I was a kid. And I says, then I followed with, well, how did you putt when you were a kid? And he said, I used to just step up and roll it. I said, why don't we try that? And I think he ran in like a 40-footer and smiled. Because you get a lot of noise in your head. But to answer your question, what happened was that U.S. Open, U.S. Opens typically are very tight golf courses, and they're better for people that are very accurate. Like, for example, Lee Jansen is one of the players I help. He won 2 U.S. Opens. He's famous for being, right down the middle. Phil isn't. Phil's all over the place. He can hit it very far. He can do almost anything. So, where the Masters, that style of play is conducive for U.S. Opens, not really. But Merriam, where the U.S. Open was, it had a good layout for him. So everything was set up really well. As history has it, Phil lost. He came in second, and it was his 6th second place. So he was a bit devastated because at the time, I think 43 years old, maybe, somewhere around there, it was like, this was my perfect opportunity. How many other times? And I remember tracking him down. I was with my family in Mexico. I think he was in Montana with his family taking a break. We went through it. He really was, for all the reasons, a great opportunity, didn't work out. He's pretty down on himself. I sort of let him, cathartically express all that. And then I brought him back to, well, what's been going on with your game? And that was all positive. All these components of his game, he's hitting the driver straighter, which was a big deal at the time. He's feeling much better putting. His numbers started to improve. Obviously, second in the U.S. Open is a pretty good result. When I first started working with him, he actually won the Houston Open the next week. A lot of good things were going on. I kind of got him to focus less on what just happened, the heartbreaking loss, and more on there's a tremendous amount of momentum right now that, we don't really need to turn it off or divert it. We need to get out there and compete. I think it changed his attitude a little bit. I mean, we had a lengthy conversation, and then he went to Scotland before the British Open. He won the Scottish Open the week prior, and obviously that helped his confidence. And then he went on to win the British Open. So that was, very rewarding for, of course, him and for me. A little bit on, seeing the forest from the trees, not letting a little setback become a huge impediment, following his course. So that's kind of the big flow of how that happened, Mike.
Let me get into an issue, and I'm going to come back to some examples as well, more golf examples and beyond golf. The yips, Y-I-P-S. Some people may have never heard of this before. I'm going to let you explain what it is from your perspective. As a baseball guy, I can think of 3 examples in my lifetime that I recall vividly. Rick Ankiel famously had to go from pitcher to outfielder because he could no longer pitch. Steve Sachs forgot how to throw the ball to first base as a second baseman. And Mackie Sasser, as a catcher for the Mets, could no longer throw the ball back to the pitcher. What is going on in the mind when such a repetitive, simple task for some of the best athletes, best players, best skilled position guys on the planet, when they can no longer do the simplest thing they've done their entire life? What's going on in the brain? What's happening? And is there a way to overcome? Because for some of those guys, I'm not so sure they ever did overcome it.
Yeah, I think there was Chuck Knobloch, too. He had a big problem in terms of baseball. But yeah, it's a great question. That I think I weighed in on one of those cases once, but the yips in golf might be a little bit different. So we can speak of both things. So when amateur golfers think of the yips, the colloquial term, a good way to think about it is I'm putting, right? And I, make a smooth putting stroke, hit the ball. And then when I get the yips, just to impact, my stroke is no longer smooth and I go fast or I stop. I don't make a good putt. And every time I have to putt, that happens. So that is called, the yips. Now, when you look at that phenomenon to try to understand what's happening, it really sort of ferrets out into 2 different things. There is a neurologic thing called dystonia. And dystonia means jerky muscle movement, if you will. To stay with golf for a moment, Bernhard Langer, who is a famous German player who's older, latter part of his career, he developed the yips. What we do when we think it is more of a neurologic component, I'll speak of the other in a minute, the fix is to change the neural network in the brain, change the motor movement a little bit. So in his case, he went from a regular conventional grip to what's called the long putter. When he did that, the yips went away. They sort of came back, I think, a couple of years later, and he has modified his putting grip and stance consistently through the years. And he is, to this day, he's performed wonderfully. He's one of the leading money winners on the senior tour and still competes with the young guys. So he's somebody who's overcome it by modifying. The other kind of yips is really more of a panic attack. And I think this is probably more like your baseball examples. There was a famous tennis player, one of the women who was one of the best in the world. She got to a point where she could not serve the ball over her head. She had to walk off, I think it was in Wimbledon. What can happen there is you sort of couple a spike of anxiety with the motion, with the contact, and for whatever reason it becomes circumscribed to, as I think the catcher example, he couldn't throw the ball back to the pitcher, but he could throw it to second base, who could then throw it to the pitcher. It doesn't make any sense. When you speak with those people, they'll tell you, there's this wave of anxiety that comes in, and when anxiety overflows, it short circuits our cortex fuse a little bit. It can affect motor movement. Jean Van de Velde is famous when he decompensated on the 18th hole, just needed a double bogey to win the British Open. Similarly, he made some incredibly bad choices. So when we're trying to figure out what the yips is, most of the time, it's not the neurologic one. Most of the time, it's more of a mental one where then the person starts to overthink, starts to couple it with anxiety. And I think of a player I worked with last month who was yipping little chip shots. And how we got him to get through it is I said, let's just pretend we're not here with me, but we're here with your son. He had a little boy who was a son, and your son had to hit this little chip shot. What would you do? And he said, I just, play it. I put my weight on my left leg. That's my front foot. I play it back in my stance, and I'd hit down on it. And I queried him, well, how would that? Could you show me? When he started to do that, he started to chip better again until he started to think about it. Then we did another drill where I said, let's pick up your right leg. So let's basically chip on one leg. And by doing that, he had to turn his attention over to his balance. As soon as he did that, he released the club head and he stopped yipping it. So you try to find something, creative to really take their mind off it so they can do it more spontaneously. And another example years gone by is I'll go out there on the course with them and I'll have a baseball mitt and I'll say, can you chip in my mitt while I'm running? If I'm running and they chip to me while I'm kind of walking in motion, they don't have the opportunity to really think much about the shot. And most of the time, that's very helpful. And they're like, wow, this is a harder chip shot. I can, hit your ball mitt. Yet when you're standing still, I'm yipping it. You try to find a creative way to circumvent what's going on.
You're getting people to not focus on that issue that they've been focusing on so much, and just a simple little tool or an invention that you throw at them can get that focus to change.
Right. We want to bypass the cerebral cortex and trust the motor movement, because we're talking about motor movements that they've been doing for, thousands and thousands of time. But when they start thinking about it, it interrupts the circuit. And that's when we get into the problem.
I'm going to come back into the book because some fantastic ideas. The notion of timeless time, the way you describe that, well, you've talked about it a little bit already. But one of the things I want to jump into is some of your quotes in the major papers around the world, most recently about the world's most famous golfer, Tiger Woods. And one of the quotes that I saw that you said was, of his recent struggles, you said it's one of the most bizarre, unusual things that you've seen in professional sports. And now you're not saying that as a guy who's trying to hate on anybody or be mean. I know you're thinking about it clinically, but why don't you describe what you're seeing with Tiger Woods? And clearly you've got the background and the foundation. You're not just a guy sitting on the sidelines with no perspective. So why don't you talk about, from your perspective though, what do you see with Tiger Woods right now?
I feel bad for him in many ways, but I think a lot of it starts after, the windfall of 2008 and, the affairs and how that all played out. Because I remember I was at the first tournament back. I was working with one of the players, and Tiger came, and he has been historically the rock star, the messiah of golf, if you will. It was odd to see him come, and where people were booing him, and so clearly I think that was very difficult. And then he had a very difficult time after that. And I remember I was asked, I think CBS morning show, about what was going on, where his opponent's getting better. I think to win at the highest level, you need some courage. It comes from the heart. And if you're not settled in your heart and that piece isn't right, it gets exposed at the highest level of competition. I think that was very, very difficult, and that set some foundation. But Tiger, with his enormous drive and talent, has fought his way back, not last year, but the year before. I think he won 4 or 5 times, got back to the number 1 ranking, which was impressive, except, he wasn't performing in the majors, which is really, his benchmark. He and Phil, guys like that, they're less concerned about regular tournaments, but they want to win majors. And Tiger has 14, Jack Nicklaus has 18. That's sort of the magic number. But what's happened of late, and so the one question is, why hasn't he been able to do it, in the biggest stage, i.e. the major championships? And I think it has something to do with this piece I've just mentioned. But what's peculiar of late is Tiger, has had a litany of injuries. He's had his leg operated, his knee, I think 4 or 5 times. Now his back. And what he's been able to do in the past is he's been able to tear his swing down to to nothing and rebuild it back up. And there are cases of people doing that, very successful. Nick Faldo did it with David Ledbetter and then became the number one player in the world. Now, Tiger's done it, with Butch. He did it, Butch Harmon. He did it with Hank Haney. Then he brought in Sean Foley. Every time you go to the well to do that, it's not so easy to do, right? It's very difficult. The best guys can, but historically, people have done it once, maybe twice. Nobody's done it 4 or 5 times. And then you have the problem with age. So age, he's almost 40. He's had operations. Physically, he's not the same as he was at 25, as we all are. So there's some limitations there. And I think that's problematic. I can't help but think, the obvious thing to me is, hey, you've been number one in the world with, these other swings. Maybe we just need to work with them and tweak them a little bit rather than reinvent the wheel. The way Tiger is, he's a bit of a perfectionist. He's gotten into this biomechanical thing, biomechanically, what's the most efficient, proficient swing that puts the least stress and torque on, his knee and his back. Which makes great sense, except in golf, they don't give the trophy for the most biomechanically perfect swing. You look at the great players, Jack Nicklaus, Lee Trevino, Arnold Palmer, all these guys had very idiosyncratic swings because it's more about consistency and, of course, score. Kind of in a way, I think he was looking in the wrong place there. With this compilation of events of, trying to get this perfect swing, his body's not as good. I think his spirit has been traumatized, by the events after around 2008 and after. Then what happened was very strange because in my 20 plus years of being around the PGA Tour players, I may have seen a player, yip a shot here or there. I've never seen nor heard of a player doing it, more than once, maybe twice, because if you do, you won't be on the PGA Tour very long. And then in Phoenix a couple of weeks ago, Tiger, I believe it was 9 times on his Friday round before he missed the cut. And let alone Tiger Woods, that would be unheard of, at the tour level. How does this happen to Tiger? So, these things self-perpetuate, like confidence self-perpetuates, the greatest determinant of confidence is, recent mastery experiences, right? It's going to make you feel good if you've just won last week. But similarly, it can go the other way. Haven't won any majors, my body's hurting me. I got a whole new swing. The next thing you know, we have doubt. Interesting enough, the swing of a chip shot, and that's where Tiger was having his problems. That's a very short swing. So that's not exactly, making this new biomechanic swing, full swing that he's doing with his new coach, Chris Como. So the question is, how does the guy with the greatest short game, you could argue he and Phil, the greatest short game, suddenly not be able to chip the ball? So something's got to get in his mind. Now, on the interviews, Tiger talks about, he doesn't know where the bottom of the swing is. There's something different on the wedge. But that doesn't make a lot of sense because the guys at that level, they could chip with a spatula. Something's creeped in, even though we see Tiger all these years as the machine, the predator, the Navy SEAL champion, he's still human. One of my other clients, David Duval, who was number one in the world once, he sort of lost it. And it took a long time for him to find it. He almost won the U.S. Open about 4 years ago, came in second. I think if he had won that, and he easily could have, he got a ball buried in a sand trap at Bethpage on the 17th hole, his confidence would have come back and maybe the last 5 years of his career would be different. But somehow it's gotten into Tiger's head. It's not a very easy thing to get rid of. And in Torrey Pines this last week, again, he had some very significant problems chipping. And I think he shot, some very, very high score. For to see a guy that great, it would be like, Tom Brady or Peyton Manning, not being able, a guy who runs a little out pattern and throwing the ball in the stands. I mean, it's a very unusual thing for guys that good. I don't know if the general public appreciates that. They certainly appreciate yipping because, a lot of us regular people do, but people like Tiger don't. So it is unusual.
Let me jump into a practical example that I think all golfers and perhaps people that don't golf can think about. So when you're out golfing, around a golf, you might spend 4 to 5 hours out there. But your shooting time, your time, you're actually the intense focus. The shot time is actually 30, 40 minutes total out of that 4 or 5 hours. So if you keep and I'm kind of going where you go in your book, I'm gonna let you elaborate, but if you keep that intense, narrow focus, that's a lot of energy expended. When you're gonna be out there for 4 or 5 hours, you can't keep that narrow focus for 4 or 5 hours. You'll be dead laying on your back. So how do people need to think about this notion of, when you're taking the shots, the narrow, intense focus, but the rest of the time kind of widening the focus and dropping the energy down so you don't burn out? I know that not burning out is not the primary issue here, but why don't you talk about that notion?
Well, I mean, it really comes from, I think, a lot of the research on learning. Let's say you have 5 hours to master some material. If you sit down for 5 hours consecutively and just look at, your books, you will not do it optimally. The studies show that, if you go 50 minutes, take a 10-minute break, and keep the intensity up, and the only way to keep the intensity up is to pulse the concentration and take a break, you're going to do a lot better. Similarly, in sports, as you point out, golf's a sport that you're out there for an awful long period of time. So what you want is maximum focus at the time of execution, and then you want maximum relaxation without getting into a bunch of negative thoughts. So it's imperative that you manage the downtime really well. I think of Nate Kading, who's a kicker I helped on the San Diego Chargers, a place kicker. And, he could go into a game, never get called to kick a field goal, get called at any time. It's difficult because he had to be ready, at the snap of a finger. There's a, fumble or something like that. He's got to be ready right away, yet he's got to sit there for however many hours. So I think you have to look at the nature of the task. So if we want to stay with golf, you're right, 30, 40 minutes pre-shot to do that. So we create a little playbook. And what I like to use there's very few sports we haven't been able to adapt it to, is what I call a pre-shot pyramid, where we go left brain, right brain, no brain. And that's the playbook of execution. And what that means is left brain, rational brain, figure out the shot. It's going to be a 6-iron, 165 yards, what have you. My line is going to be at the tree. So that's your left brain. Now, the important component that a lot of people don't do, and in particular, this is where the tour players make a mistake, is the right brain. Now let's get a sense of the shot, either visually, let's visualize it, or kinesthetically, let's feel it. Sometimes we even use auditory. What's the sound? What's the rhythm? But we sort of bring that other piece in. And once you have a sense of that, then we want you to step in and just hit it. We don't want you to think about it anymore. We just want you to hit it. So I think about some of the World Cup skiers I've helped. On the way up the chair, it's left brain, on gate number 12, it's super icy, so we have to be a little more careful. This area, we need to do that strategically. Then when they're up waiting, the Mayer brothers, who are famous Olympians in American skiing history, they were tremendous at visualizing every gate, a little like Eric Heiden with the speed skating. So that's the right brain. And then when the gun goes off and it's your time, you just do it. That's a system I've used with high jumpers, long jumpers, hurdlers, and I think, there's probably an application even in the business world. Now, that's at the time of execution. Now, the other question is, what do you do with the downtime? People like yourself, you give talks to large crowds or get interviewed, on live TV, maybe. Before that interview, it can be a little anxiety provoking. How do you handle that downtime so when the bell goes off, you're ready to go? So in golf, we don't want to grind that entire time. So Jack Nicklaus really is a beautiful visual metaphor of an accordion. So as we come towards the shot, we start to bring our focus in. And then when we're there and our caddy says, time to go, here's the yardage. Boom, we're in our pre-shot playbook, left brain, right brain, execute. Then as soon as we hit the shot, we let go. I think of Pancho Gonzalez, a famous tennis player who helped me in the table tennis when I was young at Caesar's Palace. He told me that he used to look at, the farthest tree in the distance to sort of relax himself and then come back to the point. So even in tennis, which is more of a continuous sport, it's important to take a breather where you have that opportunity. I think when we manage energy, we, have to pay attention to that because we have a finite amount of energy.
It's interesting. You bring up the idea of being on stage, and I'm sure you've talked to decent-sized crowds too. I can remember early on, maybe 10 years ago, taking a stage for the first time and having a certain feeling before of being nervous. Never really nervous once it starts, but before, or a little anxiety or just something, you just feeling that little bit of like something in your stomach. I don't feel it today. I don't say that in a cocky way. I've probably developed some type of preparation that I'm not aware of, or I've not thought about, or I've not tried to figure out, but I don't feel that today. I feel very comfortable, and it feels like, to most people, they might think, well, gosh, walking up on stage in front of a few hundred people or even 1,000 people, that could feel different. But to me, it feels like, it just feels normal. So it feels like it's just normal.
Right. Well, and that's the natural process of desensitization. So we say, the first time the tour under the PGA Tour is called the web.com. The first time you get in the web.com, you're nervous. Then after a while, it's no big deal. You play in the web.com. First time you get in the PGA Tour, first few events, you're extra nervous. But if you've been out there and you've played many events, that doesn't become a big deal. And then you can go on to the major championships. So I think, Michael, your point is well taken. It becomes the natural state of affairs. And what we tell athletes, Billie Jean King was quoted in this last Australian Open, although I don't think the quote is actually hers. But, competitive play, something along the lines of playing under pressure is a privilege. People ask me, how do these guys play under that pressure all the time? And I say, that's what they do. That's the norm. And you have to realize, it's like I think about myself when I was a professional table tennis player. Like you, I would be nervous ahead of time, and as soon as we started, it would go away. That's because I was then doing what I know how to do. And then after the years of doing it, it was hard to even get up for practice because what my norm, what my baseline was playing in a competitive environment. So I think you teach people little anxiety is good. Let's not be afraid of it. It's normal. If you keep doing this, you're going to get better. It'll become second nature.
Michael, let me ask you one last question right in the heart of your book. And that's the notion of this deliberate plan for improvement. So if somebody wants to, and your book is about golf, but there's clearly a lot of lessons in there that go way beyond golf. But the notion of a deliberate plan for improvement. So if one wants to get better, they really need to get scientific about this. And if I'm reading you correctly, this becomes almost checklist-like mentality. Meaning you've got to write down, you've really got to get very specific if you want to have improvement.
Well, yeah. The one piece about writing things down, I think that's very important. We have all sorts of ideas in our head, but they're fleeting. It's like a dream. Dream decay happens awfully quick in the morning. You might remember it the minute you wake up. 10 minutes later, when you're eating breakfast with your wife, you can't bring it back. But if we write things down, they become real. We become accountable. We sort of create a relationship with the concept. So in my home, in my garage, I have an entire wall that's a whiteboard. And whenever I get that inspiration, it could be in the middle of the night, I go make a note. That way, then I sort of create a focal point where I can go back the next day or whenever I haven't lost it and I can add to it. So I like the guys. I give them all a composition book, and we learn from their experience, whatever they may learn from friends, from people like me or what have you, and it sort of all goes in one place. So I think there's something very, very important about recording it and being able to resonate from it. That's why in technology today, even though everybody buys the Kindle books, I like the hardcover in my library so I can pull it down. There it is. The pages are marked. When I buy the Kindle books, it's almost as if they go away. Now that might be because, Michael, I'm 55 and
no, I'm 46. I agree with you completely. Maybe that's because I'm 46, but I agree with you 100%. And I've actually talked to a fairly well-known author in his mid-20s who agrees with you as well. So,
yeah, there's something about that. Now, the other piece that you mentioned is, the devil's in the details. If we want to just stay with golf for a second, I mean, people trying to improve. They go down to the range, they do the same thing, they spend more time doing the same thing, and then they wonder why they don't get any results and they don't get better. Well, that's because they're not being strategic. They're not thinking about what is it I need to do, what is it I need to work on. They're not practicing with purpose and intention. It's more of a mindless thing. We want you to be mindful. So whether it's business or whatever your business is, sports, you really do need a plan of attack. You need a strategy. One of the things I do with athletes, I say, here's your strengths. They can talk about that. What are your weaknesses? They're over here. Then I ask them how they train. Most of the time, they're strengthening their strengths rather than working on their weaknesses. And I was with somebody just the other day, in a very good player, but for some reason on holes that had water on the left, and we're talking about a PGA Tour level, he just had, such difficulty and he had such fear. And he said, well, what do you want me to do? I said, I want you to fall in love with holes with water on your left. In fact, today we're going to go around this course and we're only going to play holes with water on your left. So, we sort of normalize that, and it's taken a little work, but, I'm a big advocate is, we're the product. The result of what we do is really the weakest link in the chain. So wherever we're weakest, that's where we really need to focus our attention. We need to train/practice, with purpose. And I think it's important you make yourself accountable for it, so you can feel good. This was, and we talk a little bit about goals being result goals, process goals. Yeah, the result goal is, I want to earn $1 million, or I want to win the tournament, or I want an A on the test. But if you want an A on the test, how do you do that? Well, the process is you have to, master the material and whatever those things are. And if that's not defined, if the process is not defined, because that's where the energy needs to be allocated, because that determines the result. Amazingly enough, most people don't think in those terms. But I think it's imperative that you do. Certainly the best athletes do. They go out there, give their best, and it's like winning. How do you define winning? There's a high jumper I helped, Jamie Nieto, and at 35 years old, he made the Olympic team. Interestingly enough, I worked with him before the trials, and it is a left brain, right brain thing. Here's the win. Here's my approach to the jump. Then he has that down, and now he had his kinesthetic thing for him. He had to feel his belt buckle go up above. They do a Fosbury flop. That's how these guys jump, 7 foot plus. He texted me after it and he said, thanks, I won. And then I looked it up on the internet, and he in fact didn't win. He came in third or second, but it was good enough to put him on the team. And then when I talked to him about it, he said, I won because I did everything in my control. I executed excellently. And from my perspective, that's winning, which, of course, makes me smile because I agree. Even though somebody else won the event, it was just that guy, did better. You have to be careful how and I think of there's a player I work with who lost to Phil in a playoff at the Bell South Classic, and he was super upset. It was a 5-man playoff, and he lost on the last hole. He played marvelous, shot 18 under par, and I spoke to him afterwards, and, I lost, and we really couldn't get him to see it in another way, and he missed 6 cuts in a row. How you think about your experience is very important. How you train and plan is equally as important.
Michael, I got just a quick question. Of all the athletes you've seen up close and personal, not just at a distance, because you've been up and close and personal to many, many athletes, who's the most mentally impressive athlete you've seen? Or is that a question tough to throw at you on short notice?
I would say in his prime, Tiger Woods, because he was so dominant that, in golf, you're competing every week against 150 players. And at times his odds were 1-1 against the field, which is just incredible. Forget the statistics, but, come the last day, if Tiger was in the lead, he never lost. And to be that good for that long against very competitive fields is amazing. Now we could go to tennis. I love Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal and now Djokovic, but they trade off wins. For somebody to be so dominant for, a decade, that there was really, maybe Phil was next to Tiger, but I don't think, even if you asked Phil in that time frame, I don't think there was any question, about this guy's level. In golf, certainly Tiger Woods, my dear friend Eric Heiden in his day, you take speed skating. Today, there's nobody that races, the long distance and the short distances. It'd be like running the 100-yard dash and doing the marathon. And, Eric Heiden was the world record holder and gold medalist in all distances. So his record in his prime was amazingly impressive, but that was for, a shorter period.
Great examples. Great examples. Gives people something to think about. Hey, Michael, your most recent book, Mastering Golf's Mental Game, is out. Definitely should take a peek at that. Even if you don't play golf, I can recommend it. It definitely gets you in the spirit of our conversation today and much more detail. What's the best website that you'd like to send people to, Michael?
You can get that book, anywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. My website, which has a resource section, we have a free download for, a hypnotic induction to relax, is just drlardon.com, drlardon.com. But I wouldn't mind making a parenthetic comment about the book, because this book was a little bit different than I think most of the sports books in my first book, in that most of those books are just anecdotal. This book, I really patterned it after a famous mental health book called Feeling Good, so it has a workbook component. There are various chapters looking at, emotional control, how to deal with neurotic thought, how to stay motivated, all these different domains, if you will. And each chapter is divided into 3 small parts, and that is, we give you a little bit of basic theory on, let's say, motivation in layperson's terms, not too scientific. Then we give you a little test to take so you can see how your motivation stacks up, or how your emotional control under stress stacks up. Then we give you some exercises to do. If you go through the book and you actually, bring a pencil and you're willing to work just a little bit, it's impossible not to improve. And really all of those domains, they relate to, all parts of life, not only sports, but I think everything most of us do. Hopefully people will enjoy it, get something out of it.
Michael, thank you for taking a chance on me today. You get this crazy guy from Asia writing you and saying, hey, come on my podcast. And you're like, what in the world? But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had a good time.
I did, Mike, and I do smile when you say that, because that's exactly how it was. I do get emails from God knows where. 99% of the time, I probably hit the delete button, but I looked you up. I was impressed with you, Mike. So I want to wish you the best of luck. Hopefully downstream we'll cross paths.
Thank you, Michael. Take care. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street. This is absolutely not for you.